Hi, I'm Melissa. I go by Mel though. So I am a proud Aboriginal woman from North Queensland. I grew up in Brisbane and in Townsville for most of my life, and I moved here to Melbourne a few years ago, and I now call Melbourne home. Yeah, sure. So I was a primary school teacher who had completed my Bachelor of Education up in Queensland, and I was a teacher for a number of years teaching primary school students. And from there, I moved to Melbourne, where I taught trauma-informed education for high school students and also taught mathematics to those students, where it was a focus on well-being and cultural safety and all of that sort of stuff as well. And then from there, I moved into the higher education space where I worked for a university to embed Indigenous perspectives into their courses and their programs throughout their STEM college. And then from there, I decided to do my PhD in Indigenous education because it was obviously a space that I had lived and breathed um, my whole career, and also as a child going through school and university as a woman of colour was especially challenging. So I decided to do my PhD about Indigenous education. So I'm about halfway through my PhD. I'm coming up to my 2-year check-in, if you would say. So yeah, coming up to my 2-year check-in, where I'm just starting to collect my data, and yeah, do all of that sort of nitty-gritty stuff with data collection and ethics approval and all of that. So I've just passed that process now, and I'm doing my studies through the University of Melbourne. So it's really fun and exciting. Doing the studies, and my supervisors at the moment are Dr. Sarah French, is my primary supervisor. I've also got Associate Professor Julie McLeod, and then I've also got Dr. Fee Belcher as well. Yeah, sure. So my PhD is focusing on how our pre-service teachers, so these are the teachers that are studying their teaching degree at university. So how are they being taught at university to embed Indigenous perspectives into their teaching practices? So I'm looking at how the pre-service teachers are feeling about actually teaching the Australian curriculum cross-curriculum priorities, but then also how they're feeling about potentially teaching Indigenous students as well. And then I'm also looking at how institutions, so universities, a number of universities around Australia, are able to teach our pre-service teachers and what they're teaching the pre-service teachers in that cultural space. Yeah, so when I talk about the pre-service teachers, I'm actually focusing on just generic pre-service teachers. So I'm looking at both primary and secondary, but also potentially early learning teachers as well. So it ranges. It just depends who might be enrolled in that particular Bachelor of Education, is what I'm focusing on. So there could be a few different majors that they're going to go down. Indigenous knowledges refers to the deep cultural place-based knowledge, the wisdom, the cultural practices, and the ways of understanding the world passed down through the generations of Indigenous elders and community members. So they look at different things like the scientific, ecological, and pedagogical knowledge that's embedded throughout the community. So whereas on the other hand, you have Indigenous perspectives, this involves the ways in which knowledges are framed and how they're shared and applied in an education space. So embedding Indigenous perspectives in teaching means that the Indigenous voices and the histories, the worldviews, etc., are authentically represented in the curriculum or in the content being taught, rather than being those tokenistic add-ons like we talked about, so like the acknowledgement of country or things like that. So yeah, that's sort of the difference between the two. So yeah, Indigenous knowledges should really remain with Indigenous peoples and be taught by Indigenous peoples or teachers or scholars or community elders, because that's their knowledge system, that's theirs. So we don't particularly want, non-Indigenous people to claim that as their own. We'd love them to incorporate that by, inviting those elders and those community members in to teach that space, whereas perspectives can be taught by non-Indigenous peoples, so they can use the history and the knowledge systems with the Indigenous community to embed that within the curriculum. So it's about resourcing, it's about you know using case studies, it's about using Indigenous books, all of that sort of thing. Yeah, sure. So obviously, I haven't finished my data collection just yet. I'm in the process of getting that started. So I've just got my ethics approval to go and get started on that. But obviously, I've done a lot of literature reviews and research in that space, but also, I suppose, living and breathing in that space as well, in the university sector as well. So a lot of the things that I've found within the literature and within my own personal experience as well is that teachers are apprehensive to teach the content or teach about Indigenous culture. They're worried about making a mistake, they're worried about offending, and they're worried that they're not the right person to actually teach that content or in that space. So that's the main conversational piece that I've had with people and from the literature that I've read as well. The other thing that pops out is that our pre-service teachers that I'm focusing on have said that they feel a bit underprepared to go and teach the Indigenous curriculum through their classroom. So they haven't had enough experience through their tertiary education to be able to feel confident to actually step into that and teach that subject like they would teach mathematics or like they would teach geography, for example. So they're the two key things that I've sort of found in the literature that pre-service teachers and teachers in general are really apprehensive about. So when I've been obviously doing my research through the last census, which was quite a long time ago now, I think it was 2016, it said that we only had 3% of the teaching population was actually of Indigenous heritage. So that could be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage. So that's not a very high portion of Indigenous educators that we have out there, and not all of them become teachers. They could go down different avenues of education. So we just don't have enough of that Indigenous teacher representation to come in and teach all that content for all of our students, for all of our schools, for all of our universities. So it is something that we're asking our educators to help us out in this space and become, competent in this space to be able to teach this Indigenous perspectives piece. Yeah, sure. So I came across Nakata's cultural standpoint theory, and I was looking at his cultural interface, which is where he talks about looking at something in two perspectives. So looking at it from a westernized perspective on one hand, and then on the other hand, looking at it through an Indigenous lens as well, and then combining those together and seeing how they can work together to make the best of that situation for all people involved. So I loved the way that he describes that and the way and the work that he does in that space, because that's exactly what I was trying to achieve here, is that how can we get our institutions and our universities and our schools which predominantly are westernised content and westernised curriculum, to then work alongside our Indigenous perspectives lens and incorporate those two together to get the best possible outcome for all involved in that space. It can definitely be used across all types of subjects within primary and secondary settings. So, for example, in science, there is a space where they talk about sustainability and land preservation and land management. So, you could definitely intertwine that particular content that the curriculum's asking you to work on and include the Indigenous perspective of land management. So, the Indigenous culture and the Indigenous communities have such valuable knowledge about land management and sustainability. They've had it for since time immemorial. So they've used this knowledge of the land, and they've learned about fire management practices, living off the land, regeneration, all of those kind of things, and you can definitely incorporate that sort of that sort of aspect into that westernized or that curriculum that's currently being taught within schools. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my methodology is looking at qualitative methods. So I'm actually doing the methods I'm using are like surveys and one-on-one interviews, semi-structured interviews. And I'm looking at it through an interpretivist lens, if that makes any sense. So I'm looking at both non-Indigenous interviewees, and then obviously if we can some Indigenous participants as well would be fantastic. I'm obviously just mindful who might be in the class at the time as well. So yeah, looking at surveys and looking at semi-structured one-on-one interviews for my methods there. It allows me to be able to um, engage with the different Indigenous perspectives and the gaps in their initial education, but it also allows me to get a broad range of participants as well through the survey, so I can see like their experiences, but then also having that one-on-one interview allows me to dig deeper into how they're feeling about embedding Indigenous perspectives and how they felt they could be supported in this area. In relation to how my methodology, underpins the Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, um, it's sort of so. For example, the ways of knowing, my research seeks to understand um, how pre-service teachers develop the knowledge about Indigenous perspectives. So that's sort of my ways of knowing. The ways of being considers how the pre-service teachers themselves, like it considers the pre-service teachers themselves in relation to Indigenous education. So whether they feel prepared, whether they feel comfortable, whether they've been supported, that sort of thing. Yeah. So and then my Indigenous ways of doing looks at how pre-service teachers attempt to actually implement their Indigenous perspectives. So how are they going to do that within their classroom setting? So that's sort of what I'm aiming for. At the moment, that is subject to change, obviously, as we're doing the process. Like any thesis, things change as you go. Yeah, so I think based on some of obviously the literature that I've read and some of the experiences I've had at schools in the classroom and in universities, some of the things that I expect to pop up in these surveys and in these interviews is how they feel underprepared. Sorry, when I say they, pre-service teachers feel underprepared. They also might identify their lack of knowledge. So a lot of pre-service teachers identify that they don't have the knowledge in this space, and it was obviously a topic that wasn't taught to our generations and above at school. So it's something that's quite recent that has come into Australian curriculum. So they often feel like they're not prepared to be able to teach that because they weren't taught that themselves. And they often fear misrepresentation, getting it wrong, or offending people is another thing that they highlight to me, and what the research has highlighted as well. So that's a big key area for those pre-service teachers. Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm sure that that's probably something that's gonna come up, that teachers are going to say, that they may not value Indigenous perspectives, that it's not important, that it's, their time's too valuable, so they just don't have time to teach Indigenous perspectives because they have to do all of the other data collecting and, all of the testing that comes with teaching, which I totally understand. I've lived and breathed that. So yeah, I definitely anticipate that there could potentially be some of those sort of answers in that data collection in my findings, that it's just not on people's top priority lists. Um, Absolutely. Yeah, so I suppose what I'm aiming to achieve out of this, and I suppose anybody that starts their PhD journey, in your head, you're like, I want to change the world. I want to change this space. I want to do great things. But unfortunately, the reality of it is when you start your PhD and you have some wonderful supervisors that guide you, and they try to get you to broaden down and calm down a little bit, that you're not going to change the world overnight. And we're really mindful of that. So essentially, I really just want my thesis and my research to highlight any of the gaps that we currently have in the education system when it comes to embedding Indigenous perspectives, but also highlight how our pre-service teachers are feeling in that space and how we could potentially help them to achieve greatness in the classroom for their Indigenous students. So I suppose I'm just highlighting that this might be a gap. I'm not going to say it is a gap because obviously I haven't collected the data yet, but it might be a gap. And I'm hoping that this research highlights this for our universities and our schools and our other institutions to be able to assist in this space. Yeah, sure. Obviously, as an Aboriginal woman, I obviously went to university myself and studied education. For me, that was quite a daunting experience. I was actually the first one of my immediate family to go to university, and I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't have family members that were able to support me and help me to be able to do simple things like enroll in classes or understand that there was a huge study load that came with it. So reading textbooks and understanding content that was just in textbooks at the time. Obviously, I did my degree a few years ago now, but yeah, that was something that was really daunting. I also wasn't aware that there were services available to me as an Aboriginal woman, so I didn't know that they had a section there for Indigenous students that would be able to assist you. That wasn't highlighted to me when I started, but also we still lived in that mindset that it was really scary to announce that you were an Aboriginal woman to the world. We were in fear of racism. My dad still very much had that mindset that you were going to be targeted if you did identify as an Indigenous person. So for me, I very much kept my mouth closed, and I just tried to keep my head down and do the best that I could on my own. But thankfully, I had some really wonderful teachers in my degree, one of which was an Indigenous academic, and he was just absolutely amazing. He obviously picked me out straight away. Just something about Mob, picking out Mob is just really quite humorous. And yeah, he obviously knew my situation, and he felt like he's obviously been through that himself as well. So he was very nurturing and, assisted me in that space as well to get support. the support I needed through my degree. And I'll never forget, he actually attended my graduation, so it was really lovely to see his face in the audience, as someone that was like an advocate in your space. So yeah, that was a little bit daunting, obviously, but then obviously as I've progressed through my career and I've worked in this space, it's had some good and bad moments. Obviously, it's been so great. I've learned so much in this space, and I've been able to educate some wonderful people in the space, and I've had a lot of staff and academics that have really wanted to learn more and really just wanted to be a part of the journey and be an ally and an advocate for our Indigenous perspectives and our Indigenous students. So that's been fantastic. But like everything, and I'm sure a lot of our Indigenous scholars and our Indigenous academics have been through, obviously you've come across some racism within the academy and in academia in general. But obviously that's just something that you bring to other people's attention, that it's not acceptable. You try to stand up for change, and you try to highlight that to the particular institution that you either work or study at, and just highlight that that's not acceptable, and stand up for that change, and be that voice for the others that might come after you. So yeah, I was one of those people later in my career, not so much in my early career, but later in my career, I've been someone that wants to stand up for change and make sure that racism and inequity for our Indigenous staff is stamped out as well. Yeah, well, it's actually really funny. The person that actually not pushed me, but encouraged me to actually take on my PhD wasn't an Indigenous person. It was actually my boss at RMIT, actually, or my line manager, if you want to call it that. He obviously saw the passion in me in this area. He saw how smart and switched on I was, and he said to me, he said, "You need to do this. This is amazing. Like, you've got passion for this area. You've got the knowledge. You've got the smarts. You could definitely do this, and you will do it well." And he said people will listen to you as well. So yeah, he really pushed me to do that. So I'm very thankful to him, actually, because I would have never ever thought about doing a PhD ever. So for him to push me to do that, it was fantastic. And then he helped me make the connections to the University of Melbourne, where I do my study. So he linked me up with particular people to talk to about what it involves and what the process is before I just jumped in and signed up for it. So yeah, he was a really good key stakeholder in me doing a PhD, actually. But then I suppose people that have sort of guided me in my research, and I suppose are influences in my research space, are the likes of Eileen Morton Robinson, fantastic woman, amazing. And then another person that has recently just helped me so much as well in the Indigenous space was Nikki Moody. So she's down here in Victoria, actually, and she reached out to me during one of the courses I undertook before I did my PhD. So I met her through that, and then since then I've been able to chat to her about PhD life, and she has really put my mind at ease when I struggled with what's a methodology, what are all of these ology words, ontology, all of these other words that, us mob don't understand completely because they're just huge words and you're just like, oh my gosh, what is that? She was able to put my mind at ease and explain it to me on realistic terms, I suppose. And she really help guide my research into that space, and a lot of the research that she undertakes is in the education space as well. So I've been able to use a lot of her work to guide and support my research in my space as well. Look, I think I don't think I'm going to specifically talk to individual work. But any I think any Indigenous research that we're doing anywhere in any field is so important. Being able to have Indigenous researchers out there for everyone to see, to mentor and support our upcoming Indigenous students into that space and be that figure that they can look to and say, hey, I can do this as well. I think that's really, really heartwarming and it's really motivating. Yeah, I also think that Indigenous-led research promotes community engagement as well. It also empowers our community to have a voice as well, in different aspects of our lives as well. So obviously, in parliament decisions, in education, in land management, all of that, land rights, all of those things that are currently a focus of Indigenous research. Also in our health industry, and there's so many things that is currently included in Indigenous research. So it gives that community a voice, and it highlights that importance of being able to communicate with community and Indigenous-led researchers in that space. So I think Indigenous research will continue to change the society of Australia. So, we're highlighting particular things that need change, for instance, or that need promoting. So, I think it's essentially going to change the view of society about particular aspects of Indigenous community and Indigenous life. So things like Indigenous stereotypes with health, for instance, that brings a big highlight to that. Also racism within organisations and within schools, but then also how we go about teaching and including Indigenous perspectives in our education, so that future generations have that understanding, can critically think about Indigenous perspectives and histories, and hopefully change their point of view about particular stereotypes and racist thoughts that tend to happen in community at the moment.